Politics moves faster than ever, and uncertainty is the new normal. Welcome to The Pulse of Politics, the podcast about public affairs and how to navigate an unpredictable world. Each episode brings you real cases, best practices, and a look at how AI is reshaping policy work. Let's get started. Here's your host, Sylvan.
Jessica, very well welcome to the Pulse of Politics podcast. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's absolutely my pleasure.
You are the managing partner and global public affairs practice leader at Fin Partners, a company based in Washington, D.C., but serving clients from all over the world. Before we dive right in, we want to talk about how public affairs actually works in America today. And maybe to start off, you can walk us through your early career as a Hill staffer and sort of the aha moment that made you realize that successful public affairs is really about strategic communications and reputation management and not just about opening doors at the top.
That's a great question, and thanks for the intro. Actually, Fin Partners, I lead our Washington, D.C. office. Our headquarters is in New York, but we have offices around the world. We have 1,400 people in 40 offices. So it's been an amazing journey. I've been there at the agency since the outset. So I've been there since it was founded. So public affairs has been, I think about every 5 years or so, we've had to really reinvent what public affairs means. As you say, I started my career, as so many do when they go to Washington, wide-eyed, excited about being at the center of things, a congressional staffer. I was very lucky. I got a job there was a House placement office, and no one that I'd ever heard of had gotten a job through there, but I managed to land a job with a congressman from Wisconsin's office. And it was so exciting to be 21 years old and running around Capitol Hill and thinking you were important. But really, I was answering constituent mail at the time, which was absolutely fascinating. It's actually the fundamentals of politics, to understand what people are worried about and concerned about, and how do you respond to them? What are we doing? How are we responding legislatively? Or if we're not, then what are the solutions for everyday humans if they're not feeling comfortable? And that's what constituent mail was about. We were getting comments from Americans and American voters who were confused, upset, didn't know how they were going to solve their problems. And then as government, it was our job to try and figure out, did this require some administrative fix? Did this require some legislation? Was it simply to allay their fears? So that was a very interesting introduction into Congress. And then as I continued in Congress, I became working on legislation. And so that was more about working with the member of Congress to come up with solutions. And then the communications part of it was, how do we start to build support and coalitions for the communication solutions that we had? So if my member of Congress wanted to introduce a bill on an earned income tax credit, who would he target? How would he build support? How would he talk about it? What would he say on the floor of the House? What media would we take him to talk about it? So it was really sort of a microcosm of how you communicate directly about policy, which I think dovetails into what the broader discipline of public affairs then became for me.
This is so fascinating. That's really a wonderful starting point of this conversation. And I also wondered, with that experience that you just described, what based on your perspective, what do most corporate executives and international clients maybe also still fundamentally misunderstand about how public affairs and policy actually get shaped in Washington in today's 2026 landscape?
I think that public affairs has always suffered from a bit of a silo mentality, that maybe there are certain corporations or organizations who kind of get the fact that it is really part of the entire ecosystem that you're operating in. It's not separate. So when we have really successful public affairs activations, programs, strategy, they dovetail with communication strategy, with business strategy, with risk strategy. They don't live separately in a box. And I think that's probably the biggest mistake. So you'll get a company who, I mean, this is what the tech companies have understood really well. This is all part and parcel to growth. How do we position ourselves and create the conditions for maximum runway for our technologies, right? They've gotten that. I think for years, different companies have sort of struggled with public affairs lives in its own swim lane. Okay, here's our public affairs guy. Here's our firm that we work with. We're going to work on this particular piece of legislation, or we've got a regulation suddenly that is not helping our business or something that we want to influence. And if that's not done in the context of the broader strategy and the broader communications plays, I think it becomes a little bit less successful. So how do you integrate all of the things that you do in communications and even business strategy into creating the conditions in the government space that then are the conditions for success for the business?
That sounds super interesting, fascinating, but also like it's inherently more complex as a discipline to master to a certain degree.
I think it is. And I think that's why, I mean, there is, in my mind, it's not a practice, but it's a methodology. And the methodology is to start with both an internal and an external assessment of where you want to be in a public affairs space. So, a company will come to us with a particular problem. It's hammer and nail, right?
Right.
We see this piece of legislation and we want to beat it back. That sometimes works. We've certainly done that. We worked for the Recording Academy, which does the Grammys, and they had a piece of legislation that was about fair compensation for streaming. And we were able to build a really strong argument for fairness. And we activated all of their members who were, they're famous musicians and singers. So we got a lot of attention. We had this big event called Grammys on the Hill. So we could really influence policy. And in fact, it was one of I can't remember the last time this happened, but the Music Modernization Act actually passed unanimously in Congress. That doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
So you can be targeted, you can target a specific piece of legislation, but the broader strategy was to show how important music was to the culture, how influential it was to create messages around fairness in streaming and what it would do to artists and music and consumers of music if you didn't have fairness in copyright and payments law. So sometimes it boils down to these very technical things like copyright law, but if you can elevate the conversation to what does this mean for the average listener, consumer, voter, taxpayer, taking the sort of very specific legislative solution and elevating it to sort of the meta conversation is one of the most successful ways that we influence the space.
I love that. Wonderful example to share here on the show. Thank you for doing so. And another thing I want to also talk about is you entered the politics right at the start of the Reagan and Bush era. Walk us through what it was like stepping into Washington back then, but also maybe the differences that you have seen through the different presidencies up until the present day.
Oh, it's such a good question, Sylvan, because one of the things that you see in Washington is a small town at the end of the day, and they call it a company town. They used to say about Washington that it has all the charm of the North and the efficiency of the South, which was a joke, right? But every time you had a new administration, the culture of the city would shift a little bit. And I remember going to the inauguration of George Bush. I was a young staffer, and somehow I got seated behind Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the governor of California at the time. And I couldn't see anything because his shoulders were so broad and everybody was wearing these, 1980s suits and they had these giant shoulder pads. I couldn't see over his head. I couldn't see the inauguration. But it was a wonderful time. It really was. I think the difference between this moment where we have so much polarization and so much acrimony, and certainly there is such a partisan divide, the difference is that we worked across the aisle. And we really did. So you'd work all day, you'd, walk over to the next, member's office with a proposal. Didn't matter if you were a Republican and they were a Democrat, you'd go over and talk to your friend who worked in the office and say, hey, can you get this in front of the legislative director? And then in the evening, we'd all go play softball against each other. So there was a very different feeling. We all, obviously, there were partisan differences and there were squabbles. But when I listen to a congressional hearing now, I'm struck by the rancor and I'm struck by the acrimony because while we had that around issues, there weren't as many, ad hominem attacks where you were impugning the character of another member. I was just listening to a hearing where, two women members of Congress were, screaming about each other's appearances in the middle of a hearing. That felt to me very unprofessional. And it's a little shocking to see some of that.
I imagine. Why do you think that is? Why or how has it come to this point? Is it because of the individuals involved? Is it because of technology, for example, also social media sort of amplifying these debates that mainly happened online and now also take place offline? Why do you think that is the case?
I think that's exactly right. A bold, thoughtful initiative that's well crafted doesn't get amplified on social media. It doesn't get picked up by the rags that, take those headlines. So the way that we get our information and the way that the algorithms respond to incendiary language makes it valuable for people to do that. If you think it, so if any news is better than no news and any headline is better than no headline, then the more incendiary, the more shocking the content is, the more it gets shared. So I think that's a real problem in politics because it works against thoughtful conversation. It works against the idea of reason, because we're moving away from reason to rage. And so you see that rage gets amplified and reason gets buried. And then it becomes cultural, right? Then you have a cultural shift, which is what we've had. We've had a cultural shift. You see it in the news. I'm still I'm a policy nerd, right? I'm still reading The Economist and the New Yorker, and I'm still looking for, sort of long form, thoughtful, articles. I still read books. I read philosophy, right? But if you're getting all your news, I was at a conference and there was a very famous politician there, and she was up on the dais and she said, well, the other day I read an article, and she stopped and she said, and when I say I read an article, I mean I watched a TikTok video. So if we're getting our content from a TikTok video and we're not really being rigorous and analytical about where content is coming from and what it really means, I think that leads to this kind of incendiary environment.
I think it's also dangerous because then you sort of stop being able to think for yourself. You just take the content with a very short attention span, and then you just recycle what is being fed to you without critically analyzing or thinking for yourself, right?
I think that's right. That's the echo chamber, right? And you get your news from your feed, and then you're pairing yourself with similarly minded people who are getting the same feed. So you're not having the kinds of discussions that I think are really valuable. One of the things that there are certain institutions and think tanks in Washington where those bipartisan conversations used to be cultivated. And I think there are still some great journalists out there. I mostly see it in podcast form where they do interviews from the left and the right and the center, and and I think that's really important, to challenge yourself. And if somebody's talking about a book and it sounds interesting to you, buy the book and read it. Like, go. This is what we used to have to do in college, right? You'd take a political philosophy class and you'd read opposing philosophies, and then you'd discuss and figure out what you really believed and what you thought. And we all seem to operate on this availability heuristic where we believe the last thing that we've heard. And that's a little scary.
Absolutely. I also want to look back a bit over the years and focus on the Democratic Party and how it sort of evolved since your early days on the Hill, both from a tone and rhetoric perspective, but also from an actual policy approach. What changes and sort of development and shift have you noticed there on the Democratic Party in the US?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. As I said, back when I actually worked for a Republican member of Congress back in the 80s. So there was less divide back then between the Democrats and the Republicans. The guy that I worked for, there was a famous congressman from upstate New York. His name was Jack Kemp. And he was, the guy I worked for was a Kempian Republican. And that meant he believed in, he represented a district where most people, the older people, hadn't gone to college, but they wanted their children to go to college. So it was like it was sort of the American dream. Like, I can come here, I'm the child of an immigrant, and I can work really hard, and then I can provide for my child a better life. So the guy that I worked for created all these policies that were very Kempian conservative, which is, how do we use the marketplace how do we use business? How do we use government to incentivize people so they can do better? Things like education policy, things like creating, some minimal safety nets without discouraging people from growth. And in some ways, I think that became the foundations for some of what you're seeing in the Democratic Party. But I think there's been a real difficulty in articulating that vision. There was always this conversation in politics of, well, if I can pull myself up by my bootstraps, then why can't everybody else? And I think that was a little bit of the divide. And the Democratic Party was trying to figure out how to give people some stronger bootstraps, right? I mean, I remember this one. I'm just going to give you all these anecdotes because I think they tell the story better than my opinion. I was working on this campaign that was about bringing books to schools and libraries for children. Because one of the myths was that, well, everybody should be able to learn the same things because you would just go to the library. You're not trying hard enough. But what we found is that when we went to libraries in poor neighborhoods or schools, they didn't have books for children. You'd go to the library, there'd be 6 books for kids. So that's not equal. If you can go to a library in, Stamford, Connecticut or Westport, Connecticut, and you have thousands of children's books and a wonderful reading room and a librarian who gives you hot cocoa, and then you go to a library somewhere else and there are 3 dog-eared copies of some free drop book, that's not the same opportunity. Now, this is, obviously there's the internet now, and that then creates inequalities too, because not everybody, there are only 3 billion people in the world do not have access to the internet. I don't know how many of those are Americans, but, so it's not a great equalizer if you don't have the equal tool. So I think that there used to be more similarities between what the Republican Party and then the Democratic Party wanted to accomplish. And I just think that the politics of personality and the politics of division and the kind of the point scoring pieces of it have overtaken the desire for true leadership, which is about bravery and vision, and really finding solutions for people. We're an incredibly rich country with so many resources. And the fact that we're fighting about, we're fighting about whether or not people should have access to food assistance if they're going hungry in America, to me it seems cruel.
For sure. Yeah. Almost unimaginable.
Right. Almost unimaginable. Correct.
And I wonder also, by having shared your experiences from the Hill, what were sort of the biggest lessons that you took away from your time on Capitol Hill and basically sort of directly use them in your day-to-day business now? How did it shape the way that you approach direct lobbying?
It's such a good question. I think one of the things that I learned on the Hill was that it is an interdependent system, right? You have legislation or an idea, you have stakeholders that you have to rally around that idea. You have a communications environment that needs to create the conditions for that idea to flourish. You can have the best idea in the world, but if you don't communicate it properly, people don't understand or don't support. So I think what I learned was that it is all connected. You just can't have one thing. No, I have good friends who became sort of what I call shoe leather lobbyists. These were the people who went up to Capitol Hill, shopped an amendment for a client, brought it into the member's office. That's one piece of it. Like the language that you introduce is one piece of it. And the rest of it is, I need to create an environment in which this can succeed. And that's, to me, public affairs. That's about creating those conditions for success, creating that environment where that idea, that policy, that philosophy can germinate and actually grow into a legislative or regulatory solution.
I love that. That's really to what we discussed at the beginning, this multidisciplinary part of the methodology that comes into play here. Before we dive a bit deeper into more of the current topics, etc., there's one extraordinary chapter that I want to talk about in your career. You mentioned this story to me when we met in Paris last year. You actually delivered a public speaking and media training directly to Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. I want to hear this story again. Walk us through that story. How did the opportunity come about? What was it like to be there on the ground, and what sort of surprising lessons did he take away from it?
Well, it was a crazy moment because Chavez had just been democratically elected. He was the populist, visionary, and firebrand, young leader. This is long before things turned sour and long before the current moment. And it was very interesting. I got a call from a colleague in New York and said, "Can you get on a plane and go to Caracas to do this training?" And I was, one of the younger people in the agency, and I thought, that's unusual. So very funny. I didn't know why I was being selected for this. And I said, well, why isn't the head of our Latin America practice going? And they just said, well, he's not available. So I get on a plane with another colleague, another junior person, and we sit around and we wait by the pool for the phone to ring for our opportunity. And we wait and we wait and we wait. And then we get told to come back to the US. We're not going to get this meeting. So we go back again and we wait and we wait. And the call does come and we get screened by Chavez's right-hand man, who's a former journalist. So we finally get the meeting. And we go over to the presidential palace. We're ushered in. It's in the evening. It's probably 6:00 in the evening, end of the day. And we're taken to this big mahogany paneled room. And we wait and we wait and we wait. It's about midnight. And one of the panels opens. And this woman comes through with a cart of milk and cookies through this passageway. And behind her is Hugo Chavez, who leaps into the room, throws his arms around us, gives us hugs, and he doesn't speak a word of English, not hello or anything. He speaks only Spanish. And we had this beautiful translator who sat right next to him, so he's very happy. And we did this media training for him around. Everybody was worried that because Venezuela was the source of oil, they were worried that this guy was going to be unpredictable, which he actually was. So we did this media training around Y2K and their preparation. They were the least prepared country in the world for Y2K at the moment. So out of 163 countries, Venezuela was 163rd. So we had to talk about that. And then he was saying things like, the terrorist Carlos the Jackal was a national hero. And so I had to say, Mr. Presidente, it would probably be best not to refer to this international terrorist as a national hero. So fast forward many years later, I found out, and this is the lesson. I found out that the reason my colleague wouldn't go, and the reason we were hired, is we were actually hired by the Russian company Gazprom to do this. I had no idea. So basically, we were trying to secure the oil supply of Venezuela. And for me as a kid, I just wanted to go down there and have, this exciting adventure. But it made me realize the importance of understanding what you're being asked to do, understanding the ethical implications of what you're doing. There are so many things that we're asked to do as public relations professionals that, I think the beauty of working for Finn Partners is that I've always been able to decide which business I will do and which I won't. And I have a very, very simple compass, which is if I think that this is going to make the world a place that I would like to live in, then maybe I will take the business. And if it's something that I feel is unethical or takes us backwards or has a quality to it that I don't feel good about, I just won't take the business, because we create winners and losers in our business, especially in public affairs. It's one thing to do a marketing campaign and sell, a new flavor of crisps. It's another thing to get a law passed that changes how we, regulate pollution in rivers, right? These are important questions. So we create winners and losers, and I take that very seriously. And I only work with clients that I feel are really making a positive difference in the world. And that was sort of my takeaway from the Chavez experience, is I just kind of blundered into it. And then you see, obviously, I'm not responsible for the current situation in Venezuela, but you do see the implications of your work down the road.
Yeah, I think that is a really, really deep lesson that you took away from that. Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, you bet.
Now, if you fast forward to today, you've written also extensively on crisis communications in a shifting political landscape. How are you advising your clients right now to sort of prepare for, but also navigate the realities of the current administration? Because I imagine your job is probably, it was never easy, but it probably just got even more difficult because things change overnight, basically, these days.
It is an extremely complex time, and the lens that we look at all of these challenges is the lens of risk mitigation. I think that is the piece that has changed the most. So whereas we might have sat down with a trade association sort of and hammered out, here's our annual convening, here are our messages, here are, we're going to do our stakeholder mapping and our heat mapping. These are the states that are in play. Now we're using simulation and modeling and risk mitigation tools, AI, proprietary AI tools to use synthetic data to plan what could happen. And so instead of just focusing on here's how we're going to influence members of Congress or the European Union, it's really about creating a sort of a three-dimensional map, right? A colleague of mine who is one of our technologists says, if you sit down at a table to play chess with someone and you make the first move and then they punch you in the face, that's kind of where we are right now, right? You're not playing chess. You're playing a game that you don't know what the rules are and you could get punched in the face. So I think that that's the reality of the moment. And there are no cookie cutter solutions. There is no playbook. In the first Trump administration, part of the playbook was, well, you just need to get your client on Fox News because the president is listening to that. And now we're in the middle of so many transformations. We've got complete political transformation in the United States. We've got geopolitical transformation and shifting alliances, because I have a lot of global clients. So it's not just about the US. It's like the entire world is shifting. I had a member of parliament. We were in a closed door session. A member of parliament over in Europe looked at me and said, "You betrayed us, as Americans." Right. So this is,
Yeah.
that didn't happen before. So you're in the middle of the transformation of geopolitics. You're in the middle of the transformation of work. People don't work the same way they did. We're in the middle of the transformation around technology. We all do our jobs differently. So everything, every sector, healthcare, manufacturing, education, all of that is changing so quickly that we don't have the same playbook solutions. And we're inventing new tools every day. We're inventing new models. And I think the biggest change is how people acquire information and make decisions, right? If you asked me 3 years ago, a lot of our clients were focused on getting earned media, paid media. We would use native advertising. We would do social media campaigns. I think most people are getting their information through generative search, right?
Yep.
I mean, the first thing that you're getting is, what does AI tell you? So that's a different game. And you may just be going straight into one of your, you may be going straight to ChatGPT to get your information. So if the way that it's almost like we've rewired our brains. So we have to rewire your strategies completely to align with the way that people consume information.
And in that sense, with the punch in the face, the information that people consume, it also sounds that there is a significant amount of distrust between multiple parties, like the business, the government, and the public to start from. How do you actually build that trust again? Because I assume you need trust to make anything happen. What is your very first tactical move to create forward momentum and sort of break this distrust that we see in many places right now?
I mean, I'll be honest with you, and this sounds kind of grim, but I do think we're in a post-trust society. And if you look at so just take, for example, like the big technology firms in the US, right? Are they in a trust situation with the government, or are they in a patronage situation with the government, right? It's patronage. They're not building trust. They're building patronage so they can have a little bit of runway or security. So I don't think that there's that idea of building trust with the government. Now I do think that there are industries and brands that still are building consumer trust.
Mm-hmm.
But those conversations, like if I go back in my time machine to say, just even like 4 or 5 years ago, we were talking about consumer trust and affinity, and all of our clients were coming to us for sustainability programs or affinity programs. How do I build trust with more diverse audiences? How do I tell my story around sustainability or quality? Not seeing a lot of requests for that. It's really about it. If I go back to my chess game analogy, it's about, how do I not get punched in the face? Right? So that, I know that sounds kind of grim, but I think that that's the reality of the moment. And to play by the old rules would be to probably get punched in the face a lot.
Yeah, I imagine. In this post-trust world, as you describe it, is there a bigger demand, a bigger need for services like you offer them? Because people and companies, they're just lost. They don't know how to navigate this new world. Or are they even resigning and say, well, I don't even need to work with you anymore because I cannot do anything. I'm sort of lost in all cases.
I think there was a period where a lot of companies, organizations, and even countries were sort of sitting on their hands because it was such a monumental shift.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm seeing now is, I don't want to say a reversal of that shift, because there's no going back to the before times. That's not happening. What I'm seeing is the recognition that any public affairs work, any communications work must be done, and it must be done with this lens of risk mitigation. So because my role has always been public affairs, but it's also been crisis communications, and I've done that from the very outset. Those two go hand in hand particularly well. Like there are certain types of crises, recalls or litigation support that are sort of handled a little bit more in a vacuum. But these broader crises, like I have a lot of sovereign clients who are, they're navigating things like trade policy and tariffs and potential of military action, those kinds of things. Those are, macro, multi-strategy challenges. So we are seeing a lot more business around these sort of broader, more complex strategic crisis mitigation, risk analysis combined with the public affairs work. So where if you just pick a random example, if I'm the head of the French cheese making association, where do I want to be in terms of strategy if I know that if I fear that I may be targeted by tariffs or sanctions? How am I galvanizing support? Am I banding together with other industries? Am I and certainly what has happened in Europe is that they've looked to other countries for trade. They're looking to Mercosur, they're looking to China, they're moving away from relying on the US. So it does eventually create a problem for the United States if our trading partners are, this is just too unpredictable for us. We're going to go somewhere else. So I'm not sure if I answered your question.
You did. I do actually have a follow-up question that we could probably do its own podcast or a series of podcasts on that question. But given that what you just described, how do you see America's role in the world evolving right now? Like there seems to be a huge shift that we're already in the middle of. Where are we headed?
It's a very complex question. This administration has been very clear that this is America first, and that is very telling to our allies. I think that there are a lot of our allies have been trying to figure out how to navigate that. So do you join the board of peace? Do you not join the board of peace? Do you give the president an airplane? Do you, continue to use diplomatic relations? The rules have completely changed. So the role of the US in the world is it's a very tender and transitional moment. And I think, we are a tremendous power with tremendous resources and capabilities. And we have sort of been, we've been in one position since the end of World War II, and that has fundamentally changed now. And so I talk about transformation. That's one of the fundamental transformations. It's like, what is America's role in the world? And I think that it's so dynamic. Last weekend, I stayed up all night Saturday and Sunday rewriting a proposal to, a client in the Middle East because we were now engaged in military activity in the Middle East at a much greater degree. And so we have the situation with Iran. We've got the Trump corollary or the Donroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. That is, we've got activity in Cuba, and we had the extraction in Venezuela. We have military operations in Ecuador. People are talking about what's next. Again, it's a little bit like that chess game. You're not really sure what's going to happen next. And I tried to get out of the prognostication and prediction business and really into the sort of strategic evaluation and, using risk modeling and just know that really almost anything is possible. So,
Right.
How do you plan for all the potential scenarios? How do you look around corners? And I think there used to be a time when we do scenario planning and it would, the worst thing that could happen is that maybe the CEO would be caught in a scandal, right? Or there was a shareholder revolt. But I think the stakes are a lot higher. And we have to think, I don't want to say more cataclysmically, but we have to think in terms of massive transformation. And that's a mindset shift, right? That's really the blue sky, gray sky kind of visioning that you have to do around where could we find ourselves a month from now or a year from now. And the predictability is just gone.
I imagine. And nevertheless, often in Europe, in Switzerland, the lobbying activities, the methodology behind lobbying and public affairs of the US is often quoted as, that's the best in class. That's how we want to work. Do you see that as a good blueprint now, also with everything shifting and changing, that the US lobbying blueprint, let's call it that way, is a good blueprint for also other countries and other professionals to adapt or look up to?
I don't think so, because I think that I think other governments and other government bodies are operating differently than the US Congress now. I don't see the European Union acting like the US Congress. So if you're using the same model, I mean, it strikes me, and I could, I'm glad to be corrected on this, but it does strike me that, sort of the arguments and the stakeholder management and sort of the reporter education and member education, those things are still working in other governmental bodies. They're not working as well in Congress.
That's a very good take.
So I would say new rules.
Yeah. And looking ahead, think about the new rules, all the shifts that are happening in the world at the moment. Which arena will demand the deepest strategic capacity from public affairs leaders in the near to midterm future?
I think that everything. So I'm going to answer your question in a different way. There was a long period of time where I would sort of have to educate my colleagues or educate our clients or educate, the influential decision makers, C-suite folks, that they needed to focus on public affairs. I had to explain, well, it's important to show up and talk about this particular policy when they really just wanted to talk about brand or product or I don't have to convince anybody anymore.
No,
everybody gets it. This is what is happening in politics and policy and regulation is now, those things are all the same. Politics and policy are the same thing. They used to be different, right? So, if I'll give an example. If I'm a cryptocurrency company, right? My policy was that I wanted not to be regulated by financial regulators. I wanted to really be this like supra currency type currency. That's not a policy anymore. That's policy and politics, right? If you have a president and administration that say, we're pro crypto, that's it. You're done. You won, right? And I think there are things with much more nuance. I'm trying to give a really simple example, right? Mm-hmm. Or I would have said before this week with Anthropic, I would have said that, the administration's decision to not regulate AI or try to keep, states from passing any kind of laws regulating AI was, the political decision around AI translates to what the policy is. Those things used to be a little bit more separate. But now that you see the Department of Defense, now called the Department of War's decision on Anthropic, you can see that, it's politics as policy. And so I think that's a huge change. That's a meta change in a way. And it's not that we haven't been in that situation before. I think it's just like everything, it's just sort of exaggerated.
Yeah, that's a really good takeaway to continue thinking about and what it actually means for its own business or connections in that sense. There's one last topic I want to talk to you about. You already mentioned how you use AI, and obviously, despite all the political changes and shifts happening, AI is also a huge shift on top of everything else that is going on. So I wonder a bit, what's your perspective? How is artificial intelligence already changing the day-to-day work in public affairs? And what role do you expect AI to play, let's say, by 2030, for example?
Yeah, so I read this article a couple of years ago on upskilling, and it basically said that your success in your career will be based on your ability to learn the tools that are introduced. And it used to be those tools would be things like the way that you captured your business development through NetSuite or whatever tools you were using, the way that you were managing the financials, the way that you were reporting. And AI is, again, one of those fundamental transformations of not just the workplace and the work, but of how we think and the way that it is transforming. So, for instance, say you have a client who's a tourism destination, right? How does that show up in generative search? If I go to my browser and I say, what's the best place that could go to on the Riviera, right? The smart destinations have already loaded up the content, so it will show up in generative search. And so it's changing the way that we market. It's changing the way that we access information. It's changing the way that we do research and monitoring. When I saw my first sort of AI demonstration in public relations years ago, I thought, oh my gosh, we're not really going to need any employees anymore. But we are. And the thing that I challenge us to do as a practice, as an agency, is think very long and hard about what's the human enterprise in what we do, because we are an art and science practice. It used to be that PR was all human enterprise, but we are art and science through and through. And there's more science than art in some ways. So thinking about what the art is, we still do convenings. We still go to Capitol Hill. We still interface with reporters. We still must rely on our subject matter expertise to really inform strategy. Sure, we can use AI to learn. Well, let's look at the history of how X, Y, and Z has been regulated over the past 30 years. Very useful, very important.
Yep.
Turn this into talking points for my client. But if you don't have the subject matter expertise and the experience to make sure that those things are right or not hallucinated or not somehow faulty, that's where I think we get into trouble. So how do I think it'll change us by 2030? Gosh, I don't think I can even imagine, because when I was at a dinner last night with some friends and we were talking about COVID, in New York City, and how they can't really even remember how awful it was. You couldn't go out of your apartment. You couldn't go shopping. People in New York City were dying. The morgues were full, and most people moved out of the city if they could and went to a place in the country or to the beach if they had resources. To look back on that and think that that was only 5 years ago, and to see how much that has changed our daily lives. I grew up in a world where you went to work 5 days a week and you drove your car in and you were in the office and you were there all day long. And if Congress is in session or something was going on, you stayed at the office late at night. It's unthinkable now, right? Nobody does that. That's COVID was a fundamental, complete and total transformation of the way that we worked and the way we thought about society. And I think AI is the same thing. So I can't even begin to predict what that will look like in 5 years.
We're in for a ride, that's for sure.
I think we're in for a ride. Exactly. Yeah. It's gonna be interesting. And I think that is, again, I never want to be old school. I never want to be outdated about things, but I think that a lot of younger people have lost their ability to write critically because they're using AI for writing. Just the same way that the young people that I see who were sort of in college during COVID have a hard time making eye contact at the office and talking to people because they didn't do that in those formative years. They didn't have those internships and fellowships. And now they're just kind of either have to learn those skills or maybe they never get them because they have more of an online world. I really, really try in my personal life to do things that are in real life. I go to concerts, I go to plays and musicals, I go to comedy, because I like the human energy that gets exchanged. But we are moving into, it feels like we're moving into a world where we have less and less of that human interaction and more human machine interaction. And to me, that's, I think there's something that's lost. And I don't
I agree.
exactly know what it'll be, but it'll be the exchange of human energy. It'll be the power of, I mean, it's really great to like warm up a pizza and watch a Netflix show and have dinner. Yeah, sure, you can do that once in a while, but there's no substitute for going out with friends and having an interesting conversation and hear what's going on in their work or what their sports team is doing. And if we become too dependent on the machine, I think those are the pieces that we lose.
Fully agree. Yeah, let's be conscious about that and protect these precious moments because it would be a shame losing them.
Yes, absolutely.
What is the earliest red flag a public affairs or a crisis situation is about to derail?
I think you can start to feel when you're losing ground. The media starts to turn against you. You start getting more difficult questions. You're not getting the responses that you want from sort of your key allies. You start to know that you are not on the winning side.
What is one ethical line that you will never cross?
Well, we talked earlier about ethics, and I really, really believe that what we do has so much power that if I don't believe in the outcome that my client or a prospect is trying to achieve, I don't think that it has to be purposeful for me. So I don't want to just do this job to show up and get paid. I want to do it to use the power that we have as communicators to make the world a place that I want to live in. So something that I feel takes us backwards or is kind of wrong in any way, or if a client is going to mislead the public, I wouldn't do it.
Beautiful, this intrinsic motivation. I love it.
Yeah.
What is a better use of campaign budget, a broad coalition building or targeted direct engagement?
I think it's a balance of both things. I think that there is, that kind of one-to-one building champions is really important. But when you build those champions, showing them that you have a broader base of support and creating that environment and air cover and sort of the ecosystem that allows them to do the right thing or make the decision in your favor, I think it's really important. So it's a 1-2 punch.
Love it. And the last question for you today. In one sentence, what fundamentally separates good public affairs practitioners from the truly exceptional ones?
I think that it is the willingness to be iterative. There's no one set strategy that works over time. And this is really about learning and iteration. So I think of success as being iterative and being convergent. So having creators and researchers and subject matter experts, as well as sort of the public affairs piece of it, is really critical. And so those become iterative, smarter programs as you go forward.
That's perfect. That's a wonderful way to end the episode. Jessica, thank you so much for your incredible insights. It has been a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show. I wish you all the best and thank you again for your time and for being with us today.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to The Pulse of Politics, a Delos podcast about navigating uncertainty in public affairs. For more insights, visit delosanalytica.com.